think we've got the tech sorted out, so we'll get started. Thanks for joining us all tonight. We've called this session as an informal gathering of Port Lincoln as a request from Mark and the team at EPC Foods. So Council recently had a presentation and update from SA Water and presentation on the SARDI modelling. So this is the opportunity for the EPC Foods and guests, and we're joined by Glenn Ingham, who's representing Hands Off Boston Bay, and we'll also hear from Mark Andrews, CEO of EPC Foods, and Dr Paul McShane from Global Marine Science, I believe, who's travelled all the way from the beautiful east coast of Tasmania to join us this evening. So with that, before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the Bungala people, the traditional owners of the land that we meet on tonight, the continuing connection to land, sea, culture and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within our community. So this is an informal gathering of council. It's not a decision-making forum, and I guess the primary purpose today is to hear from Hands Off Boston Bay, EPC Foods and Dr Paul McShane, just in relation to the science and the modelling around the desal plant in particular. I'd just like to quickly hand over to Mayor Diana Mislov, just to say a few words.
Firstly, just like to welcome everybody. We will be recording this meeting tonight and putting it on our YouTube channel so that mayors and CEOs from other regions that haven't been able to join us this evening can view it later at their leisure, and anyone else here or wider in the public realm might like to tune in. So I'll just get the speakers to perhaps note that the tech is here and hopefully working. So welcome everybody. In addition to the SARDI and SA Water, we also heard on Tuesday in Kimber from the Eyre Peninsula Landscape Board. So it was quite a nice rounded sort of government space that we heard from, and it'll be great to hear tonight from the speakers in connection with the industry. So there'll be question time at the end, I think. Is that how you'd like to work this?
Well, we can have questions during the presentations if you like, but otherwise just jot them down and wait at the end is the best way.
Yeah, and we'll just limit those to the councillors and CEOs and mayors that are here this evening at this time. Anybody else with questions, you're more than welcome to perhaps submit them to our CEO, Matthew Morgan, for someone to answer later on. I think that's all we really probably need to do. So welcome Glenn, and enjoy the presentation tonight.
And thanks very much to the Mayor and to the CEO, Matthew. Just a point of introduction, the Hands Off Boston Bay is a very loose coalition of people mainly in Port Lincoln who are against the desal plant at Billy Light's Point. There's nothing formal about it. I've kind of been thrust to the front to be a bit of a spokesman at times, but there's nothing official, but we are just all on the same page about stopping the desal plant. Just a bit of background about myself. As I said, my name is Glenn Ingham. I've been associated with the seafood industry for about 45 years, including 10 years of government, inside PIRSA, inside the enemy, as we say sometimes, and I was the manager of seafood industry development. During this time, I spent a lot of my time travelling and promoting on behalf of the government the clean, green environment, which we produce our seafood. Our companies use that tool as their number one tool when marketing their product, both in Australia and overseas. I think we should bear that in mind as we go on tonight with this presentation. A polluting desal plant at Billy Light's Point is contrary to both this in effect on the marine environment and also as a perception of what is happening here. Hang on, that's the point. Bottom one? Yep. That's right, sorry. Okay. Can we do a quick end there? So that's the agenda I'll go through tonight. The importance of this decision, the history of what's happening around in that part of the world, Billy Light's Point, the stakeholders involved, the government and SA Water's perspective of this, and also what we believe is the role of council, which is very important. The next one is that one. Okay, this is a critical time for Port Lincoln and Eyre Peninsula. This decision to build a desal plant there flies in the face of all common sense. I mean, so many people are making the comments about this desal plant. Why is it being put there? Why is it being stopped? It just defies it. But this is a critical time because they're ploughing on ahead to do it. So we have to be very careful. Just on the history of that area around there, some people know it very well and some probably don't. For many years, the fish factories discharged effluent into Proper Bay, and the abattoir was there for many, many years. And the damage that abattoir did over the years with red meat products, blood and fat, it lasted for many, many years. The area at the bottom of Pond Freezers Road was knee-deep, even hip-deep in a sludge for 20 to 30 years before it finally dissipated. The water movement around there is very poor. The exchange of water is very poor. We've only finally, in 2023, got that area reasonably clean. There's a shipyard there, which you can see in my photo. Now, that shipyard is a very important part of Port Lincoln. It's owned by a very big fishing company. For many, many years, that shipyard discharged waste from the shipyard into that bay. Not deliberately, but in those times, old practices and little compliance, the ships cleaning hulls of paint and lead-based paints, most of it went into the harbour. Some was captured, but a lot wasn't. And that's all out there, now covered with silt and some other sand, but it's there and it shouldn't be disturbed. Disturbing it will happen if they start putting pipelines down and suction for the intake, pipelines for the outtake, plus the dispersion of the water from the desal plant. If that stirs up that sediment, watch out. I want to point out very clearly now that this is no reflection on the current management and ownership of that shipyard. I'm sure they're complying now to EPA regulations, but this is historical. It's a fact. People don't like to talk about it or think about it, but it's there. When I challenged the Saudi scientist here a few weeks ago on that, he said, that's outside my brief. I don't know anything about that. That's for someone else to worry about. We talk about the sewage. This is SA Water. They've got a sewage plant around there. It's been there forever. Over the top of the hill and around the corner. Raw sewage went out there for years. There's the old story of blind mullet. Anyone know what a blind mullet is? Blind mullets, there were many of them out there. Yes, they've cleaned it up now. The solids are taken out, but the grey water is still discharged there. That grey water contains all sorts of pharmaceutical compounds, estrogen, steroids, plus the cocktail of hard drugs. Port Lincoln rates very highly in the testing of hard drugs when they test the water. That's all in there, and that's not taken out by reverse osmosis desal. There used to be an old rubbish dump down there. If you go down by Navigators College, there was a rubbish dump there for many years. Open, no gates. People dump stuff there day and night. Drums of 44s with all sorts of chemicals and oil. It's all in there. It's now being bundled to try and stop it leaching in the environment, but it's there and we always have to be aware of it. So why cause another pollutant to go around there? That was the dump, out of sight, out of mind. A desal plant is not a pretty facility. Produces beautiful clean water, but it's a pollutant. And Dr McShane will talk more about that later on. The reverse osmosis, the pipes have to be cleaned maybe daily or weekly, reversing the pumps, and it cleans all the membranes. And that's a very high cocktail, if he'll go into it, of harsh chemicals to clean those pipes and to force it back out into the ocean. And that's where it goes. So SA Water, they want to build a Billy Lights Point desal plant. At the moment, it's a reasonably small plant, but you don't have to be too too dumb to realise that that will be doubled and tripled very, very soon, within a few years. And my question is, if you came along and wanted to build an industrial facility right there to put those pollutants into the bay with clear agreement that you can double and triple that factory over the years, you wouldn't get past the first base. But because it's SA Water, they're allowed to do it. Well, I say, not in our bay. Going to the stakeholders, of which there are many. Aquaculture. Mark will talk earlier, later on about his company. There's a mussel company there that employs about 75 people, maybe to 100 soon. A Kingfish Farm, which employs about 140 people. There's supporting jobs of about 60. There's 300 jobs just in those two companies, and they're in the bay. Professional fishers. Now, not everyone can go fishing, so we get our fish from a fish shop. They fish around there. If they're displaced from that area for any reason, for hypersaline waters or chemicals in the water, they'll be put somewhere else. But the pressure's already harsh on those professional fishermen. Recreational fishermen. Now, this is a big one. Hundreds of families have got tinnies and small boats here in Port Lincoln that fish particularly in that bay. It's a sheltered bay. Not everyone can get a big boat to go outside the harbour and fish outside. You go there on a Sunday in the summertime, there's hundreds of boats there, and I mean hundreds of boats around there. Where are they going to go? The businesses support them like tackle shops, the boat sales, the fuel suppliers. They're all at risk because of this desal plant. Then we come to tourism, which is a very important part for this council. Tourism is big. People come into town, have accommodation, go to the cafes and they buy fuel. They come down and they fish in that bay. They fish in all our bays, but that one in particular, it's sheltered and there's fish there. There's blue swimmer crabs, there's King George whiting, there's squid. It's all there and they come down especially for that. You imagine pulling up in a great big desal plant there, polluting the bay. And then there's the general public and the citizens. Don't leave them out. There's a lot of people who don't fish. A lot of people wouldn't have a clue about what's going on. But they talk to me about desal plant and say, we don't want our marine ecosystem put at risk. A desal there puts it all at risk. Now, SA Water and the government claim this is run by time and money. SA Water, they claim Billy Light's Point provides the quickest solution to ensure long-term water security. Yes, they're trying to frighten us by saying we're going to run out of water. There'll be all sorts of things. There'll be rationing. If it's so critical, get on with Sleaford West. The selection committee determined Sleaford West, and actually Billy Light's Point was the bottom of the list. Shouldn't have even been considered, but it was the bottom of the list, but it was the quickest solution. There are other desals being mooted around Eyre Peninsula. One at Cape Hardy. There's all sorts of different things being mooted. The government should be looking at those solutions, not putting one right in front of our doorstep. I mean, successive governments on both sides of the political spectrum have sat on their hands for years, mainly Labor, because I've been in the most, but they've done nothing about it. They've sat on their hands, deferred it. And here we are in 2023, whoops, we're going to run out of water. In 2009, whilst I was working for PIRS, I happened to go to Kangaroo Island and speak to a hydrologist there. But unfortunately, he's passed away, but he's a well-renowned hydrologist who'd worked on this water, Yuli Basin. And he said, you've got some big problems there. You need a desal plant in the next 5 to 8 years. You better get cracking on it, otherwise there's going to be big trouble in Port Lincoln on water supply. Here we are, 23, still haven't got it done. Well, Sleaford West has been recommended. Let's get on with it. To talk about money. We don't want to be flippant about money. We're 150 million they talk about. They say, well, it was in Parliament. I think Minister Scriven to a question from somebody who said, oh, what's wrong with these opponents? Do they want to waste 150 million? No, we don't. But in the context of what's happening here, 150 million over the next 30 to 40 years is the way that accounting's done. And it's on everyone's water bill. I mean, the Adelaide desal plant costs 1.4 billion. 1.4 billion. It's rarely used, but it's an insurance for Adelaide's water. And they'll need it one day. Don't worry about that. And we all pay for that. So the fact of saying that, lucky out you people, your water bill is going to go something through the roof is complete furphy. The other one I want to talk about, which is a bit of haven't got this one yet. This is about noise of a desal plant. Desal plants hum hour after hour, after day after day. Those motors hum, hum, hum. And when they reverse the pumps to do the cleaning, it's like jet engines taking off for probably 2 to 3 to 4 hours as they force the water back through the desal plant. I've got a friend of mine who lives at Henley Beach. He says he can hear the desal plant from Port Stanback from his house when it's running. He's in this room at the moment. So, SA Water, they say the science is okay. There's minimal risk for the pollutants. They won't do much damage. It's all within international limits. Any problems that arise can be engineered out. That's what with the pop-up, SA Water pop-up made that claim to several people who went there. Oh, we'll engineer it out. Yeah, maybe. So counter science to Sadi and SA Waters, which we'll hear from Dr McShane in a moment. But they say a shallow bay with poor water movement and water exchange is not the place for a desal. I hear people in Port Lincoln say to me, what's happening about the desal? I said, well, it's still going on. They said, oh, no way, they wouldn't be so stupid. Or no way, they won't. Anyone knows it shouldn't go there. Well, they are. Well, they intend to. And we need the council, particularly the council and the people of Eyre Peninsula, to be strong and loud in our voice here to stop this Billy Lights point. Yes, we need fresh water, not disputed. Yes, we understand cost. We don't be flippant about cost. But the cost, extra cost of, for example, to Sleaford Bay, as opposed to the massive cost risk of destroying that bay, is far too high. I'll leave you with this comment. There is no social licence for a desal plant at Billy Lights point. The risks are far too high. Thank you.
Then I think we've got Mark Andrews, CEO of EPC, who's say a few words.
Thanks,
We'll
Matthew.
introduce Dr McShane.
I will.
Yep, excellent, beautiful. Yeah.
Thanks, Glenn. And thank everybody for coming, taking your time out. I know everyone's time is precious. You've heard from me a couple of times in the past, and I honestly do feel a bit like a broken record on this, but my position hasn't changed from the very first day I met SA Water. I won't tell you too much about my history, but I moved here to Port Lincoln for one reason. I was a mussel farmer in New Zealand. I moved here for one reason, and that was the abundance of mussel spat in Proper Bay. I considered Tasmania and also considered Port Phillip Bay. But the respective governments of both those states were bending over backwards to get me to go to their states and set up mussel farming down there. SA government, they listened to me, but they weren't bending over backwards, but I made the choice of coming here to Port Lincoln. And today we employ 76 people within our boats and within our factory. So we are currently Australia's #1 mussel farming operation, employing 76 people, and we represent 65% of the nation's mussels. Port Lincoln's unique. Just to be able to catch a spat out there on Proper Bay between June and September every year, and compare it to anywhere else within Australia or even Australasia, is very unique. And that's what my business was built on. When SA Water first came along and met with me to discuss the idea of putting a desal plant on Proper Bay, I said to them, what about my mussel spat going up the intake? Their comment was they didn't know that I caught mussel spat. They thought all my mussel spat came from a hatchery. Tim Kildare at the time was leading the charge for SA Water. He was astounded. He's like, really? You don't get anything out of a hatchery? I said, no, I get it 100% from catching natural spat in the water here, and that's what I do. So they hadn't done their homework straight away, and I put them on the back foot. And when we had one of our very first meetings here at SA Water, head office here, or head up, whatever you want to call it, Mark Dubell from Sadi, who's the chief scientist, he was there. He stood up that day and he said that if you asked me where to put a desalination plant, I'd tell you not here at Proper Bay in Boston, and Proper Bay at Billy Lights. I asked him just recently about that comment that he made when he was here just a couple of weeks back and gave the presentation. And his answer was he wasn't sure what size of desalination plant was going to be put in at the time. So anyway, I counted that and I said, well, Mark, there's a very high chance that we'll have a bad year of spat catching in 1 year. I've experienced it in New Zealand. We have a really good year and we have a couple of bad years. In fact, there's areas in New Zealand where they don't even catch spat anymore and didn't for a number of years, but then it just comes back. It's a Mother Nature what gives us the spat every year. And anyway, so I said to Mark, what happens if Mother Nature gives us a bad year here in Port Lincoln and gives us less spat to catch? There's potential for it to go in the intake. Yes, there's a 5%, there's a 20%, there's a 50% chance. Whatever happens in that particular year that Mother Nature does with the currents and with the wind, Paul will go over all this in his presentation. It might not happen 1 year, but it could happen the next year. And if I get Mother Nature gives me a bad year of catching spat, and I'm building my business from 2,500 tonne to 3,000 tonne, employing 76 at the minute and more later on. If I experience a bad year, well, I'll take it on the chin if there's a bad year. But if there's a desal plant out there that is competing against taking that spat in, I won't take it on the chin. And I'll fight this process all the way through, right to the very end. So, and that's what I said to Mark, I said, what happens when it's scaled up? What happens then? He had no answer to it. So, and then we go on to the site selection committee. They got together. When I put together Hands Off Boston Bay, we had the foreshore get together. We got it all postponed. The site selection committee was formed, and they chose Sleaford West. Billy Lights was always there. It was never going to go away, and I knew it was going to come back and haunt me, and it still is today. But as I said, I'll continue to fight it. I have taken the advice of planning consultants, and when and if SA Water do put an application in, I know at the various stages where I can get involved and prolong the process, and I can prolong the process. I could prolong the process for 3 to 4 years, and I'll spend money on it. I've spent a lot of money on it already, and I will continue to. Do I want to? No, of course I don't. But I want to protect what I've built from nothing. Of those 76 people, I came here, we started the business, I amalgamated with Andrew Puglisi. We are where we are today, and we're up there on the pinnacle. And the one underlying thing is that natural spat. I can't afford a risk. And they cannot say that there will be no risk. They've clearly said that there is a risk, but they can't quantify what level of risk. To me, that's just go and find it do it somewhere else. So I'll continue to fight it, and I really do hope that I won't have to. So most of you have seen my operation. That's where we are today, and I took the opportunity to get Paul here. We had the SA Water Sardi presentation a few weeks ago. I haven't had the opportunity to get Paul and the respective scientists from Sardi together around the table. Susan Close has been to Port Lincoln on a number of occasions, has not looked me up once, even though she has said in the press that she has consulted with the aquaculture businesses. She hasn't. She hasn't consulted with Clean Seas or myself, has not reached out to me once. But being in the newspaper there last week, when I made a little bit of noise to say that she hadn't reached out to me, guess what? The following day, I got an invitation to meet up with Susan and Scriven in Adelaide, and no doubt David Ryan, CEO of SA Water, and I believe some of Persa will be there as well. So my business is built on natural spat. I can't afford a risk of any of it getting taken up in intake. I can't afford the risk of the water quality getting any worse, or can't afford the water quality having any effect from a desal plant to stop me from harvesting. I want to continue to grow my business from where it is today and rely on that natural spat. There's all other scenarios about what happens when they put the pipelines in, and will it disturb the seafloor? Yes, it will. And what happens with the seafloor? Any cysts that may be lying dormant? Could it affect the water quality? Could it stop me from harvesting? What happens with all the sediment that comes from the slipway over the years once that's been disturbed? All these ifs and risks. It's just like Sleaford West was a choice. Yes, it's going to cost a little bit more money. Go on out there and do it. Why put this little business at risk? And all the other things that Glenn touched on a minute ago. So I thank you for your time. As I said, the main purpose today was to get Paul here to discuss SA Water Sardi's presentation that you all heard a couple of weeks ago. We just haven't had that chance, and I've asked for that chance for Paul to get together with Saudi scientists get around a table, talk about it, share the notes, come up with an option, instead of one over here and one here. They're not doing it. I asked them to come to the Nautilus Theatre recently. And I have been forthcoming on asking for exactly that. And they've just stonewalled me. And honestly, SA Water just rushing into this. They rushed into it initially when they thought about Billy Lights. They've had years to sort it out, way before my time here as well, probably. And all of a sudden now it's come down to cost, and the Marine Science Review Committee said it's low risk. I can't accept low risk. No one can accept risk in their business, especially with Mother Nature. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you have taken on board what I've said. A lot of you have heard it 2 or 3 times from me. We've been out in the water, and I have explained to you, well, I could talk for ages, but Paul's a guy who's here tonight. I've explained to you when I catch my spat, how I can set 2 lines on one day that are 30 metres apart. One line will catch very well and the other one won't catch at all well. It's because we're the Mother Nature, and the currents and the wind are taking that spat. I can catch on the bottoms, I can catch on the tops. It's so variable year in and year out. And that's mussel farming. We rely on Mother Nature 100%. Thank you very much.
Paul McShane, I'd like to introduce you and welcome you up. Yeah, that's so right. Thanks, Mark.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me. My name is Paul McShane. I'm a marine biologist. I have more than 40 years of professional experience working in Australia and New Zealand, including working with Saudi a long time ago with Karen, who's now a councillor with Port Lincoln Council. I'll start by saying that desalination can be part of the water security solution on the Eyre Peninsula, but I can't think of a worse location for a desalination plant than Billy Lights Point. Let me tell you why. But I'll start by just pointing out a few serious issues. As we've heard, SA Water commissioned a report by Saudi Aquatic Science to model the potential impacts of a desalination plant at Billy Lights Point, asserting that it will have no adverse impact on beneficial uses. The report, presenting a hydrodynamic model, does not provide convincing evidence that there will be no serious impact, does not provide convincing evidence that there'll be no serious impact. The model of the impact has major flaws that apparently remain unaddressed and accepted by the government. As Glenn has noted, there's potential to mobilise accumulated toxicants in the sediments of Proper Bay. That's in the construction phase and potentially during the operation phase. And this has consequences for the community of Port Lincoln and businesses that rely on clean, unpolluted seawater. And we've already heard from Mark what the consequences for his business and the other aquaculture industries that are obviously viable and have world-recognised reputation for their clean breeding credentials across the world. So what are we dealing with a potential desalination plant at Billy Lights Point? Well, first of all, the intake's going to be nearly 2 Olympic swimming pools of water per hour, every day, every week. And a discharge more than a swimming pool's content of brine, that's twice the salinity of seawater, and a cocktail of chemicals that are used to maintain the desalination plant. So world's best practice, recognising the potential impact, is to situate desalination plants in high energy coastlines away from valuable biological resources. Clearly not the case in Port Lincoln, that obviously have valuable biological resources, but not a high energy coastline. So the Saudi report starts off by recognising that the construction and operation of a desalination plant can have ecological and environmental impacts. And the potential impacts include disposal of high salinity desalination brine and the associated harmful, or potentially harmful at least, maintenance chemicals, and the potential entrainment of eggs and larvae of important organisms, including mussels. So I'll be concentrating on those two impacts. I'll touch on the shipyard issue, but those are the two impacts that really remain of serious concern and haven't been adequately addressed, in my view, by the SARDI report. So the maintenance chemicals in desal effluent. Now, this cleaning occurs twice a day, and this is from SA Water's document. And there's the cocktail of chemicals that are used: hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, a bunch of other stuff. And this relies on an adequate dilution, 40:1, to avoid any toxic effect on valuable biological resources. So what we need to consider in situating a desal plant is just make sure that those chemicals can be diluted. And that's why in world's best practice, you situate a desal plant in high energy coastlines. And even then, you situate them away from valuable biological resources, which importantly could include abalone, oysters, fish, and mussels. Important not only to the industries that rely on those animals, but also to commercial and recreational fishers, as we've heard. So here's a desal plant situated on a high energy coastline. The desalination effluent goes out, it's rapidly diluted, and hopefully there's no adverse environmental impact. Now, here in Port Lincoln, what do we know about the water movement? We know that waves, tide, and wind influence water current. The tidal movement varies, including zero currents, dodge tides. We're all aware that every couple of weeks there's no water movement at all attributable to tides. And the winds are mostly westerlies and southerlies, particularly this time of the year. They're fairly strong between June and February. Shallow seabeds reduce currents inshore. Now, this is an important point, which I'll expand upon in the next few slides. And also the SARDI report noted Proper Bay, important mussel growing area, important area for recreational fishing, is largely dependent on wind direction and strength for its water movement. So whichever way the wind blows, that's where the water goes. Now, this is taken from the SARDI report, and there's a few things that I want to expand upon here. First of all, the site of Billy Lights Point, this intake site, coincides with the shipyard and the sewage that Glenn was talking about. So during construction, this is an obvious issue that the mobilisation of heavy metals and other toxicants that have accumulated in those sediments over years will be mobilised and have obvious adverse environmental impacts. SARDI, in validating their model, set up two current meters, one here and one here. And what they wanted to do was to see whether or not their model coincided with the water currents that they measured at those two locations. What they didn't do, though, was measure the water currents in the area where we're concerned about, that is the intake and the outflow of the proposed desalination plant at Billy Lights Point. We know that the wind's important in influencing the water circulation and water currents, and therefore the dilution of any brine and chemicals, particularly in Proper Bay. And we know that the prevailing winds are going to come from the south and the west, which means that they're going to be pushing that effluent back in towards Billy Lights Point, and they're going to be transporting mussel larvae and other important biological organisms towards the intake. So what I've done in the next couple of slides is attempt to reproduce the slides that SARDI presented in their public presentation. They're fairly wordy, and so I'll just capture the key points. The model successfully reproduced salinity and water currents. It doesn't. In short, a wide range of ocean conditions were captured by the model, particularly winds. It doesn't. Background circulation driven largely by winds. Proper Bay and Boston Bay had increased connectivity with intakes located near Billy Lights Point. In other words, their model notes that wind circulation is important, particularly in Proper Bay, and that Boston Bay and Proper Bay are connected primarily by wind-driven circulation. So let's have a look at the SARDI model. Now, what I've tried to do here is distill a whole lot of technical information and just point out some of the obvious flaws in the SARDI model. They measured currents offshore 11 metres to 17 metres of depth. The deepest part of Proper Bay is 10 metres. So in terms of representing the water currents of Proper Bay, they're measuring currents in deeper water, not shallow water, remembering that water movement slows down inshore. The model over-predicts tidal current speed, which means that they're over-predicting the dilution effect, the dilution of that brine and effluent. So what we see up the top here is the model in blue and the current meters, sorry, the current meter measurements in blue and the model in red. So the actual currents here in blue are underestimated by the current meters. So the water movement predicted by SARDI in terms of tidal movement is overestimating the dilution effect. It poorly predicts wind-driven currents. So down the bottom here is the wind again. The red is the model, and the blue is what the current meters measure. You can see that there's very little correlation between what the model is predicting and what the current meters are measuring. So the model is not predicting water currents that are primarily driven by wind, and wind circulation is important in Proper Bay. And even despite these flaws in the model, SARDI report notes that the increase in salinity and the potential for long-term accumulation of salinity and maintenance chemicals were smaller when outfalls were sited in better flush locations. So they're recognising that Proper Bay is a poorly flushed location. And someone who's a lot more qualified to talk about hydrodynamic modelling than myself is Professor Joachim Kempf, Flinders University. He's probably the most experienced in terms of the hydrodynamics and oceanography of South Australian waters. He concluded that the authors of the SARDI report do not provide evidence that demonstrates the predictive capability of their model for assessing the transport, dispersal and fate of brine, discharges and planktonic larvae associated with the operation of the proposed desalination plant. So SA Water talk about it's been independently reviewed, etc., etc. Here's an independent review that has exposed serious flaws in the SARDI model. So just to summarise here, the SARDI modelling to predict desalination impacts. The claim the model predicts water currents. Well, the evidence is that the model for tidal currents is fair. They predict 50 to 70% of the variation in water currents due to tides, but the model performs poorly. In other words, it doesn't reproduce the currents due to wind, accounting only for 5 to 25% of the variation in currents due to wind. Claim that the salinity increase with desal discharges within natural variation. The evidence is that the model of the salinity variation due to the discharge of the hypersaline brine is poor to fair. That is, that it accounts for 8 to nearly 70% of the variation in the salinity due to their impact evaluation of the brine discharge. I've already pointed out that they're likely to overestimate the dilution because of the variation between what they measured and what the model actually claims to do in terms of water movement. And so the inshore retention of brine and maintenance chemicals is likely. In other words, the dilution, the 40 to 1 dilution that they need to avoid any toxic impact is potentially unlikely to occur. And more seriously, we know that the hypersaline brine is heavier than the background seawater, so it's likely, particularly during dodge tides, to accumulate on the bottom and cause what they call these dead zones where oxygen is reduced and kills basically everything on the seafloor. So again, I don't want to overemphasise this because it is localised, but nonetheless, this is an impact that is of serious concern, particularly to beneficial users of the waters off Port Lincoln. Claim that 1%, less than 1% of mussel larvae removed by desalination intake. We have absolutely no reliable information on the location, duration, timing or abundance of mussel larval production. As Mark Andrews has already said, they takes their chances with Mother Nature, and for SARDI to make any claim whatsoever, it cannot be reinforced with any defensible evidence. We just don't know enough about the ecology of mussel larvae here in Port Lincoln or anywhere else for that matter. So the nearshore water movement, I've already pointed out that SARDI attempted to validate their model by putting current meters out in deep water. But what they should have done is to validate their model in waters that are more representative of the likely impact area, that is in the shallow waters of Proper Bay, where the intake and the outflow are located. So the water currents slow down in shallow water. So I've already pointed out that they're overestimating the dilution effects by tides by about 20%. If they were to measure the water in the shallow water because of the effect of the seabed, they would find that more than likely the water movements were even lower than they predicted, which means that the saline and maintenance chemical impacts are much greater than already predicted by SARDI. So that is a serious concern. Mark mentioned the low risk. This is pointing to a risk much greater than just low, particularly given the serious consequences for the beneficial users of the waters of Port Lincoln. And so the particles, including the mussel larvae, are more likely to be entrained in nearshore waters. That is because the waters slow down in the shallow nearshore waters. We know that the wind drives the currents in Proper Bay, and the wind currents predominantly from the south and the west are more likely to entrain those larvae near the site of the intake and therefore be entrained and removed from the environment where the mussel grower is expecting those mussel spat to grow and settle naturally. So the SARDI mussel modelling claimed to be based on discussions with local mussel farmers, and they predicted the movement of larvae based on their model water currents. I've already pointed out that the modelling has some serious flaws that are most likely to overestimate the dilution and the dispersal of mussel larvae. We don't know a lot about mussel larval ecology. We know that they're broadcast spawners. They produce a pelagic free-swimming phase that stays in the water column for 2, 4, maybe up to 10 weeks. We don't really know. But during that time, those mussel larvae are going to be vulnerable to being sucked in by those 2 swimming pools worth of water that occur every hour with the desalination plant operation. And even then, SARDI recognised that improvements could be made with a better understanding of the larval duration and mussel development. So they recognise that they don't really understand enough about the ecology of mussel larvae to characterise that risk. So we know that seaweed and other particles accumulate near shore. That's just evidence of the water movement slowing down, and that the SARDI model predictions are highly unreliable and ignore fundamental processes influencing larval dispersal. So that's another serious flaw in their modelling. So just to quickly sum up, we know that water currents in Proper Bay, which influence the dilution of the desal effluent, are driven largely by wind. The SARDI model does not reliably reproduce wind-driven currents. At best, it accounts for 25% of the variation in water movement due to wind. They did not measure in water currents in shallow waters representative of desal intake and outflow, so they cannot reliably predict effluent dilution or mussel larvae entrainment. Now, this is the report that the government is relying on to claim that building a desalination plant at Billy Light's point, is going to have no adverse effect on beneficial uses. And yet, these are some of the flaws that any person can identify with access to that report. So the claims that the desalination impacts are benign are based on demonstrably flawed modelling. And just to touch on that issue of the accumulated toxicants in the sediments at the site of the intake, there's no evaluation of the potential to mobilise accumulated toxicants in the sediments of Proper Bay, at least in the construction phase and potentially in the operation phase, given the recommended uses of diffusers. That's high pressure water movement to disperse the saline brine, saline brine. So I'll conclude by just quoting from the SARDI report itself. They note that future validation and development of their mussel model to evaluate the risk of entrainment of mussels should be better informed to characterise the risk of larvae being entrained by the desal intake. And the modelling presented, that's the results that they're presented, should be considered in the context of current and future cumulative environmental impacts in the Port Lincoln region, which is home to South Australia's most valuable and productive aquaculture zone. So that's from their own conclusions. So thank you for your attention. If you want to get more information, there's a lot more detail that is contained in these reports, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just open up to the councillors, CEOs, mayors. Are there any questions? I've got a couple, but I might wait and see if anyone's got any. No, not so far. All righty. So just a couple of things, if I can comment also. So we had Dr. Susan Close come in to visit us here in the chamber, and she did ask us, the CEO, Matthew Morgan, and myself, what would give us some assurances from a government perspective. She said that we wanted, obviously, the site selection committee recommendation, which is Sleaford, and she said the science doesn't justify the expense of another site, right? So they're relying completely on that SARDI report. And I also know we had a presentation here from SARDI, and we've seen that also now at the EPLGA. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that science, and whether at the end of the meeting that we had here, Mark Dubell was very cooperative, and he was saying he would work with you, and you actually, through Hands Off Boston Bay, submitted some questions. I'm wondering whether you got answers officially to any of those questions. I'm not sure who to ask this of the three of you, but whether you've got any answers, and whether you've got anything further with Mark to actually collaborate, because we did hear Mark Andrews say that there hasn't been some collaboration there. So, firstly, did you get the questions answered?
There were several issues raised with Mark Dubell from SARDI after that meeting. And he said, that's things we should follow up, I've heard nothing from him since.
And the questions that were put, have they been answered at all?
No.
No, not at the time.
We have to remember here, SA Water is the villain at the moment. We say the villain. Not the state government yet. The SA Water is the people proposing this, and they're the ones that need to be have their minds changed. The government supporting it because they say they've got SA Water's report, and that says from SARDI, that's what, remember, they're government scientists working for a government department for a government outcome. You conclude from that what you like, but that's the facts. So
okay, we
have to continue to hammer SA Water to change their mind.
So Mark Dubell said at the EPLGA meeting in Kimber that he was working with industry to gather new information and to use more modelling as more information becomes available. So has there been any collaboration in that space?
No, there's been nothing. I mean, as I said before, and not only on the night when Mark was here, I put the offer again to get out there and to get these guys around the table and to talk and to share their notes and talk about the findings, but they haven't. And when Susan comes to town, they don't reach out. They're doing nothing at the minute. So what I have to do to actually get these guys to talk and get around the table is beyond me.
All right, well, when she did come to town, she did meet with Matthew Morgan and myself, and also SA Water reps and some of her advisors. And we did ask at that time, which as per a council recommendation that was passed by our councillors, to have meetings with concerned industry. And to that, she said yes, she would be more than happy to. And both Glenn and Mark, you know that I rang you after that meeting and said that she was open to that, whether that was her coming here or whether it was quicker for us to meet with her in Adelaide.
We had the meeting with Susan and Scriven, etc., as I mentioned before, on the 11th, Thursday week. We're in half an hour. I mean, not only us, but there's other business, as you know.
So there are four meetings, EP Seafoods, Clean Seas, Yamba, and the wreck fishing. So half our slots, one straight after the other. So we're going to need to be very concise and you know, have some preparation already done so that there's, you know, these questions that have been put that haven't been answered need to be collated somehow from all of the sectors so that we can actually just put it all in a.
Well, that's right, Diana. But I mean, they are we put the invite out there for these scientists to get together. We'll sit down and we'll do the same old thing for that 30 minutes allocation that we had on Thursday week, and we'll walk out there and it'll be back to where we were beforehand. So, you know, we'll go there and have the same spiels, talk the same stuff, and then away we go. We've got to get them around the table.
Just on that meeting,
these guys.
Minister Closes did say she would meet sometime in September, depending on her diary. The Lincoln Times had a story last week about the claiming to come over and talk to industry. No one's had any contact with her on that point. Next day, an invite to come to on the 11th of August now.
Yeah, well, I don't come forward. It won't happen in September. It's all going to happen.
They brought it ahead, which is good.
I mean, the other thing is, you know, they're my landlord.
Yeah.
I took that bit of water on as it was 15 years ago. So if you're my landlord, you want to go and start changing the basics of what I took on. Well, sorry, you can't do that without having a chat to me, right?
Yeah.
Have a chat to me.
Yeah.
So come on, seriously, I've been paying beautiful money year in and year out to PIRSA, police and licenses, water quality management, all that sort of stuff, still do now. But, you know, where's the respect for me, from my landlord to come and talk to me, and they haven't done it. It's just wrong.
I'll just make the comment that I've just addressed the claims that are made in the SARDI report that's publicly available. I haven't gone outside that. I've simply focused on the results and their claims that their model accurately reproduces currents which influence the dilution of brine and toxic chemicals. That is demonstrably incorrect, and that they need to be able to reinforce that claim with evidence, given the potential seriousness of the impact of hypersaline brine and potentially toxic chemicals, let alone the mobilisation of toxic sediments, to justify that claim that the government's relying on.
But I believe that we won't get any replies from SARDI directly, because that report belongs to SA Water. And SARDI may want to debate us, but they're not allowed to. So SA Waters want to unlock them, and the government need to push SA Water to unlock it. It's a whole thing. In Mark DeBell from in his defence, he was asked to do something. He was given certain parameters, and he did it. Now, his report is flawed, as we've just heard, but he says, that's it, I'll put my hand up, you can't get me, my report belongs to SA Water.
Just another question. Okay, so when we heard the presentation in Kimber, I have previously asked Mark DeBell about the measurement at Proper Bay and why it was in that deeper water and not in the shallower part of the bay. He tried to simplify it all, and some of the members here would recall he talked about an AFL stadium and how you would you could go around an AFL stadium and tap everybody and count how many people there are, or you could count them at the gates, which would be much easier. But I said to him, and this was supposed to assure us that counting them at the gates or at the higher water level was going to be a more accurate result, right? At the lunch break, I went and talked to him about that and challenged him on that and said, what about the evaporation of your AFL attendees, that are in the shallow part? How do you account for that? And he said the evaporation was in the modelling, but it took 10.8 days to flush that water out from the proper bay and to count the movement, through those that modelling. Can you comment at all on, like you did have up here as flawed, that measurement in that higher water and not the shallow water? Can you comment on that? Because they just keep saying it's in the modelling. And to me, it should have been measured and the more shallow, back there, hang on.
I'll go back to this. This is what they're relying on. So there's two figures. One is the tidal currents, and the other is the wind-driven currents. They call it the weather band, but it's primarily wind. So in the top, the tidal, you can see that sort of cyclic, as you'd expect. The dodge tides are there, 0. But what their model shows is that the model currents are much less than the measured currents are much greater than the model currents. So you would expect them to be closer together? Yeah, you'd expect that those red bits would be next to the blue bits. But you can see the red bits, which are the model, and what the current meters measure, which is the blue. So the blue is measuring a current that is about 20% lower. This is just eyeballing it. And a measure of the correlation between what the model measures and what the current actually records is given by a variance figure, which varies between 50% and 70%. So the correlation between the measured values and the model values are between 50 and 70%. So that's with the tide, and the tide is the best performing predictor of all the water movement drivers. The wind is terrible. It's on this one, it explains 5% of the water movement, and this one explains 25%. So in other words, 95% of the water movement is unexplained by the model in one current meter, and in the other current meter, 75% of it is unexplained by the model. So in terms of predicting what happens to the dilution of the brine and the toxic chemicals by the wind, the model is silent on that. And so they need to address that. Yeah. And that's with the current meters in the deeper water, let alone putting them in the waters which are more representative of where the impact is going to occur, both in terms of the intake and the outflow. And if they did that, then they would more likely have reduced tidal currents and reduced other currents driven by the wind. So it performs poorly on the wind and less poorly on the tide, but it's not representing the waters that are characterising the risk, either of entrainment of the mussel larvae or the dilution of the brine and the toxic chemicals. And they need to sort that out, without talking about football stadiums and that sort of thing.
It's going to make it simple for me, but it just made it worse.
Go and do the measurement.
Yeah, okay. Just on the size of the desal plant, I believe the modelling's on 8 gigalitres, isn't it? That's on the maximum side.
No, they measured, and they make a point of this, that their estimates of impact are conservative because they're modelling a 12 gig. A 12 gig.
Yep. The EP Landscape Board did say that if we didn't look after the Ely Basin, that we would need 3 times the size desal plant that's proposed, and that was a concern for me also. So they said that that was the maximum then, that 12, sorry, not 8, but that was the maximum that they could go with. So if it turns out that the Ely Basin is under distress and is not recoverable, this desal plant won't surface us anyway.
Well, I started my presentation by saying that I couldn't honestly think of a worse location from a desal plant in the whole of the Eyre Peninsula than Billy Lights Point. And I hope that my presentation has exposed a few issues why. And SA Water needs to present, in fairness to the community of Eyre Peninsula, a solution to the water security problem that doesn't risk all the beneficial uses of Port Lincoln with a dangerously flawed proposal that is likely to have a serious impact on beneficial uses in Port Lincoln. You know, that's at the nub of it. And the government needs to be aware of that.
So I guess the call to action then from Hands Off Boston Bay and from the industry, like I know that they gave us from an SA Water perspective, the engagement that's going to happen, which will be a lot of other government departments and also key stakeholders like the City of Port Lincoln, the project reference group, which has already been established, and the aquaculture industry, First Nations people, our site neighbours, the community reference group, which is to be advised, and the Bungalow Determination Aboriginal Court. So, you know, they're drilling at the moment on Bluefin Road. There was drills there again today, the geotechnical services, soil testing, and putting into place what they're calling design plans. So they're locating where the pipes are and everything, and trying to do design plans for the DA, because I quizzed them on it. I said, what are you guys doing? So that's what they're up to already. They've already got the site there at Billy Lights Point. It's, you know, it's just driving along. So, you know, I guess it's about the whole development application process now, getting approvals from local government and from all of our other government agencies and those stakeholders, and trying to put that DA up for approval. Yeah. So it's about what, you know, like what, apart from the meeting that's happening with Susan Close, the EPLGA still have a recommendation that's in force that supports the original site selection committee, as does our local council. And I guess that we're hoping for that continued support at this time.
Just talking about consultation, Rex Patrick, who's been doing some FOI investigation on this, it costs a lot of money. He got a report that promotion so far for Port Lincoln's Billy Lights Point spend by SA Water is just gone over $700,000. Now they've got a pop-up shop around the corner here. They fly over people twice a week, and we've got first-hand information. A person who sat alongside one of these people coming over last week, this person played dumb. So, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm in the pop-up shop. Are many people coming? No, we had 2 last week, and one of them was asking where the toilets was. Yeah, that's what they're doing. They'll spend $1 million on promotion before they're finished, and that's their consultation. It's almost scandalous that they just don't want to talk to people. They'll talk to them in that situation, but they haven't got the answers.
Are there any other questions? Anyone? Thank you, Steve.
Yes, Steve Woolley, Deputy Mayor of Lower Eyre. Basically addressing you, Glenn, has your group asked what's the life expectancy of this plant? First part. And secondly, what's the time frame for paying it off? Now, I happen to know what the answers are.
Yeah.
And SA Water, well, was SA Water blaming SA Treasury? And I think you need to ask that question.
Yeah. The life of the plant, we don't really know, but they're talking about its costs being recovered in 30 years, whatever that means. But you know, if you look at your water bill, you probably get it before that. But our water bill's amortised over the whole state. We know how that all works. But for the SA Water to go and say 2 things, I've heard them say: if you keep stopping this plant, we're going to run out of water. Secondly, you want your water bills to go through the roof. Well, $1.4 billion for the Adelaide desal plant is on your water bill today. Now, we're not being flippant about money. We understand 150 million is a lot of money. But in the context of infrastructure projects by SA Water, it's not. Now, SA Water say their budget doesn't allow for it, then they've got to go to the government and ask for it. If they haven't got it, they go to the feds and ask for it. If that's not happening. Why? I do not know. We've asked and asked and asked. Dr. Rex Patrick on his questions, some of our politicians have tried to ask that question, do not get the answer. We're not really considered, I don't think. I don't get into politics, but I don't think they worry too much about us. But it's got to be stopped. We just can't allow it to go ahead. It's not only this plant, it's when it's doubled and tripled and quadrupled, maybe when we're all gone from here, and that place will be full of desal plants, because the water is going to be needed more and more and more. As not Dr McShane, when I spoke to this hydrologist many years ago, who'd worked on this over here for SA Water, he said the Yearly Basin, it's the sand hills is right there. That seawater comes in, you're looking at 2,000 years before that actually repairs itself. He said a desal plant's needed now, 5 years. That was in 2009. If that membrane water there breaks down there, we'll all be getting bottled water. We understand that, but get on with Sleaford West, or get on with Cape Hardy, or get on with something, but leave Billy Life Points alone.
Got a couple of questions, if that's okay. Yes. It might be from Mark. So just in regards to the Northern Water Supply Project, have they talked to you about that? Do you understand if they are still leaking that? Because the media release came out suggesting that the outcome is dependent on that Northern Water Supply Project, which at a stakeholder reference meeting with them, they've said they've got nothing to do with the Port Lincoln project. So I'm just wondering if they're still kind of talking about the Northern Water Supply Project, still supporting Port Lincoln.
I don't hear from SA Water.
Okay.
I don't hear from
Yeah.
Saudi. And I've always had the opinion that it's not my job to suggest or tell someone where to locate a plant.
Yeah.
I can say, not a very nice point for these reasons. And that's my scope.
Yeah. And probably just for Glenn then, also the National Water Grid Fund is managed under the Australian government, and that has funded other projects.
Yep.
No significant projects in South Australia. PIRSA used to be the state government applicant. They're no longer. It's now moved to the Department for Environment and Water. SA Water have made a claim that they couldn't actually apply for Commonwealth funding because they needed more business case stuff.
Yep.
But I think we need to explore that as a possible solution of moving forward to get this Sleaford West option back on the table.
Yeah, the National Water Infrastructure Fund was hit heavily before the last election, federal election, and the bucket was empty. I believe it's been replenished and there's money there, but the South Australian state government needs to apply.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
But they're the ones, and for some reason they don't want it.
Yeah, well, Susan Close is also Minister for Environment and Water, so that's a good opportunity to maybe have that discussion as well.
But the part that's so frustrating, every time you talk to them or gets any conversation or any dialogue goes on, they hang their hats on the Saudi report. It's all fine. What are you people going on about? We've got our Saudi scientists. Mark Cabell is a scientist, I know, but he's a lovely fellow. But his report was narrow and it didn't take it into consideration. He kind of, when he was here, he didn't admit to that, but he kind of said, well, you know, that's what I was told to do, Glenn. That's what I've done. Yeah. Don't badger me. I'm out of here.
One thing you did say, do not understand muscle larvae, muscle spec.
That's right.
Just fine.
Yeah, clear as that. Yeah. Does not understand it. Yeah. So is that not enough to say, well, okay, go to Sleaford West?
Yeah. Maybe it's some of those key messages that you need to bring to Dr. Susan Close at that meeting. Some of those
I feel the
key
meeting of the elections are going to be. We'll be there. We'll have our bit, but you know we've got 30 minutes and they're going to say refer to the Marine Science Review Committee, Marine Science Review Committee,
And for all your point, that he didn't say that he didn't understand it. He said as far as he could No one understood that.
Yeah.
Right,
Something broader than just English,
So,
just
yeah.
no one.
nobody knows. I don't know, I've been doing it for 25 years.
Yeah.
Just
But he
going back,
admitted that's what I'm saying. He didn't just say, I don't, he said, as far as I don't know.
just going back to Councillor Hollenby's question there about the national water grid, Infrastructure SA needs to make those applications. I understand. Maybe our CEO might be able to support that. But and they were going to look at the Northern Waters project as a priority rather than our EP one, Desal Plant one. So and I think a lot might hinge on that whole Northern Waters application. In fact, we've got representatives here from AMP, Cape Hardy, also wondering what's going on there in that desal space. So, yeah, it's a what wait and see.
Infrastructure SA are an independent agency from state government, but they're putting together the business case for Cape Hardy. They're not looking at Port Lincoln at all, and they're not linking it to Port Lincoln according to their stakeholder reference group meetings. So it's just if they start bringing in those conversations, that's not actually linked. That's not what the Northern Water Supply Project people are actually discussing and talking about at all. And they are being upfront with the community, saying this is not a fix for Port Lincoln.
But in that case, SA Water made no approach because SA Water want to produce their own water. They don't want to buy it off that one. They want to produce their own.
Which could be an SA Water owned facility, or it could be another proponent, which only you guys will know.
But I just want to finish off by saying, this is a presentation of the council and the elected members and other mayors and CEOs of the councils. But we need you to support us. We can't do it by ourselves. Hands off Boston Bay. We're a collection of people who just said this is ridiculous. But we need the power of the council to really get this up in front of lights, because without that, it's going to go ahead. I can tell you that. There's a lot of issues going on, and
2 years. I'll postpone it and postpone it and postpone it, and we will be drinking boiled water. But I'll still be growing muscles. I tell you that.
And what a waste of money! What a waste of money, legal money, to frustrate it for years, both this side and that side. There's a lot of money involved there, and we're only hearing in the last 2 weeks that some of the bigger players in Port Lincoln may come to the party with some of this money. EP Seafoods have already spent a few dollars on this, and I would like to harness some of these other people, but we don't want to come to that. Who wants to take litigation for going on 2 years whilst we go on water rations? It's not necessary. Stop it now. Start Sleaford Point, Sleaford West.
Right. There is a question in the back.
You let ask? Yeah.
So if it's a quick one, we don't normally take questions from the galleries.
Okay. I'm looking at Eyre Peninsula strategic regional plan for 3 years. One for 4 weeks for 9 years. This piece of infrastructure, I really encourage the council to start thinking about 50-year plan. Europe does it, Asia does it, Australia still thinks in 5 and 10 years little bits. On a 50-year project, this sort of thing, 150 million is a reasonable amount of money to spend. My question is, if all of Eyre Peninsula councils are in favour of the proposed site of Sleaford Bay, is anyone knocking on the door of government to ask for more money?
Well, I can tell you that from the site selection committee, when that was originally prior to disbandment, because they'd fulfilled their brief, they did actually send 2 representatives to the Commonwealth government to ask for funding. They produced a couple of documents to table, and they said you have to apply through the National Water Grid, which meant building this business case. The site selection committee didn't have that in their brief, which was, it was given to them by the state government, what they had to do, which was just to select a site and recommend that to SA Water and to the state government. So their brief did not include building a business case. It is something that was discussed at one of the last meetings before they disbanded, having done their job. So maybe that's a discussion for, EPLGA or perhaps another platform to see whether or not we actually go back and build that business case, but that would have to be funded. And they did say that would take quite a long time. I did at the time say, well, if we start now, we'll be like months, we'll be months down the track before we will have decided we should have started this months ago. But that wasn't discussed at the time. We did have a meeting here with the lower Eyre councils to discuss that a bit. And it didn't get a lot of traction because it was not going to be funded. Yeah, I don't know if you've got anything else you wanted to add on that.
But Mayor, the issue is the state government need to apply. They need to do the business case. They're going to be the applicant.
I mean, before we wrap up, I think thank everyone. I do have a question for Dr. Paul McShane. I think just to address the meetings which have been scheduled with the Deputy Premier and Minister Scriven, I think I wouldn't just take that as half an hour as a procedural thing. I think the conversations that we had with the Deputy Premier were genuine about wanting to understand the concerns of stakeholders here. So I think it might be half an hour. Generally, from my experience, that is all you get with ministers and deputy premiers. So I think we need to, and the Mayor and I and Peter, who will be the acting CEO after I finish up here on the 25th, are likely to be in attendance to those meetings on the 11th as well. So I think it's around making sure we maximise the key points to that process. I think there's a couple of key themes that have sort of gone around in discussion tonight, and I think having been involved in the process since the original announcement 2 years ago to where we are now, I think the key thing here is that, and Glenn's touched on it a few times, is the state government is confident in what they've been presented in terms of the modelling. So I think from my perspective, sitting here listening to this tonight, the key point from the time that we had with the Minister, your Minister of Primary Industries, and the Deputy Premier, when we meet with them on the 11th, is really to ask for a deeper conversation around the modelling on which they've based the decision. I don't think there's anything to be gained from wanting to have a public session with their science and our science. I think, if there's a genuine opportunity to have Sadi and Dr McShane meet together, not necessarily in public, but in a closed conference to actually go through that.
Yep.
Maybe even bring in members of the Independent Marine Science Review Panel that provided guidance to the Site Selection Committee and actually understand some of the responses behind closed doors and then feed that back to the government. Because ultimately the government is the one that needs to make the decision to pursue additional funding. And I think the conversations that we've had, and Deputy Premier said it directly to us, is there is no business case to pursue more funding when the science says that the risks can be mitigated. So I think that's the key point for the conversations is we as council aren't convinced that the risks have been identified and mitigated, and council's resolutions on this position at the moment is around the risk. So I think that needs to be the first point, because it's not about convincing SA Water, it's about convincing the government that SA Water is given them information which is lacking and the additional money needs to be sought. And then they need to be confident that they can convince the federal government to invest additional money as well. So I think that needs to be an underlying theme that we take to those meetings. I think the other factors that have been raised tonight, I'm curious to know what level of engagement there's been with EPA, because some of these matters to me seem like they're EPA matters, not necessarily SARDI modelling matters around the toxicity of the water, the sediment that's below the surface that could be disturbed. So I'm interested to see what sort of
Actually, on that, we have had a marine biologist in Port Lincoln has approached EPA about what parameters have they put around the desal plant of Port Lincoln, and they said nothing exists in their documents at the moment.
Okay, so that's another point that needs to be highlighted.
I'm sure SA Water, but
yes.
officially they've got nothing.
Yeah. But I guess the question and part of this is the at some point it's around evidence-based decision making. And I guess the question to Dr. McShane is, you know, is there a level of detail that SARDI could provide in their reports if they enhance them, or did modelling with additional data collection that could give you a bit more confidence as an independent person looking at this, that the modelling could be good enough to make a decision on? Because clearly that's not your opinion at the moment.
Well, the fundamental problem with the SARDI report, which, as I said, is publicly available, is that the model doesn't reproduce wind-driven currents. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. The fundamental problem is that they don't reproduce wind-driven currents, which are the primary driver of circulation in Proper Bay, where the intake and the outflow are likely to be. That means they can't characterise the risk, which is based on the model dilution of the effluent and the entrainment of the mussel larvae. So the maintenance chemicals relying on a 40-to-1 dilution, they can't determine whether or not that's met or not, because their model doesn't reproduce the wind-driven currents. It does a fair job of the tide, but even then, they're overestimating the dilution based on what they measured in their current meters in the deeper water and what the model actually says. So that's there, and they need to be able to say, to justify that public statement that their model accurately reproduces the currents and the dilution effect of the desal plant. It doesn't. And so if they've got access to other information that can reinforce that claim, then they better do that.
Yeah. And I think, you know, it's, without stating, I mean, this is a challenging issue for a lot of the stakeholders and decision makers in this room and obviously online and beyond, because there are risks here, and that's why we're all here talking about it. But I guess the other thing that we need to look at, and I think it was in your slide, Glenn, around time and money. So I guess we need to understand the real risks around the water security timing issue as well. So I think that's something as the councils need to be informed around those processes as well. So I guess councils are looking at this from multiple angles. So I think, you know, it is around risk. So I think if we can take that to the meetings 2011 and try and you know, get a little bit more, get some of those answers around the science, because fundamentally that's what the decision to go ahead is going to be based on.
Okay,
Are there any other questions?
Any other final questions? No, I should have put in apologies from Jack Ritchie, the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Andrea Broadfoot and Councillor Lillian Pointer, sorry. And I also want to thank the gallery for their interest in the media here tonight as well. And if you just put if everyone would join me in thanking the presenters tonight for their presentation. But finally, if there are any other questions that come to you later, maybe if you flick them through to our CEO, Matthew Morgan, he can collate them and we can try and fill them out or direct them the best way we can. Rightio. Thanks everybody for this evening. Thanks, guys.
I'll go home and